Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on building and enforcing API standards at scale with Swagger tools and the Open API specification. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We know, as we start 2019, I'm sure everyone's got a lot going on, so we appreciate you tuning in. We ran this same session back in December, and what we heard from a lot of people is that they wanted us to run a separate session. Maybe some of you invited some of your team, maybe you heard from others, and so we're excited to present this session to you again today. Today, I am here joined with Nathan Wright, who has worked with the Swagger team for a while now, helping both teams and large organizations better understand how they can really scale their API development and standardize using the Swagger tools. And we'll be taking a deep dive into API standardization and how tools like the SwaggerHub platform can benefit your organization. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in and let Nathan get started, and we'll look for questions as they come in. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Once again, my name is Nathan Wright. I'm the product marketing manager for our developer tools here at SmartBear, so covering Swagger, SwaggerHub, as well as a few other things. Cool. So we've got a few different things that we'll go through here. We'll start with just a kind of a quick introduction. We'll talk a little bit about SmartBear, who we are, what our relationship is to Open API and the Swagger tooling. We'll go through some different slides about the kind of value or why people seem to be so interested in standardization, why it's such a hot button topic now. We recently ran and we'll be publishing soon a pretty exciting survey. We got, thousands of responses, Ryan, from different developers, practitioners, providers, consumers, all about the state of API. So we've been collating that together, and we were able to pull some metrics and some data out of that we'll use in the slides and presentation today. Once we kind of go through that, we'll propose a workflow, and this isn't me, saying this is the way to build APIs. This is saying, here is what has proven to be a successful workflow across different organizations. And I think the important thing here with anything in development and with software development, we want to be able to take that, but then map it to our own needs and our own goals, and be able to understand how that would kind of translate to everyone's kind of organization. We'll talk about some of the benefits of influencing or enforcing one of these workflows as we suggested, and then we'll do a quick demo using the SwaggerHub tool. And we think it's a really good platform for enforcing standards. We have a new feature that we rolled out, which was the kind of impetus for the initial webinar, which we got, again, a ton of engagement for, and is completely focused around API standards and enforcing standards across an organization. So yeah, we'll dive right in. As Ryan mentioned, feel free to post questions, chat, Q&A. We'll leave some time. I'll try and leave some time. I won't talk too much at the end of the session, just around, so we can kind of go through those and see if there's any that we can kind of talk through and might be pertinent to the wider audience here. Terrific. So let's jump in with just a quick introduction here. Anyone who's not familiar, we are Ryan, Nathan. We work for SmartBear, so we work with the Swagger tooling and the SwaggerHub platform, but it is under the SmartBear umbrella. And SmartBear is a pretty interesting company. We have a ton of different products, really focused on the full life cycle story. So from the initial kind of planning and design that we'll talk about today into that development space, we have some really powerful products in the testing field, as well as monitoring and deployment. Some different solutions there. I think we have a kind of a unique model in that we really do support open source projects and platforms. Things like Swagger, there's open source kind of components and pieces of that, the editor, the UI. We have a ton of people using that out there in the industry. On the testing side, we have something like SoapUI, which is an open source testing platform. And then we, of course, have kind of professional grade versions of that. So, for instance, Swagger and the Swagger tooling, open source solutions are great, but when we start to want to use those at scale, how do we really enable that? How do we do things like enforce standards? How do we manage teams? How do we create a workflow without, essentially building our own product in-house? That's really what SwaggerHub is designed to do, kind of elevate those open source solutions to a professional grade. When we look at the product map here, again, a number of different kind of channels or different paths that we can follow. On the top of the screen, we have our UI tooling. So we've got a lot of stuff around building kind of user interfaces in Collaborator and kind of that code side, as well as testing. So very similar to what we will talk about in a second with APIs. The idea here really with all these products is that we are able to take kind of the artifact one, for instance, a test complete script, a UI test script, and we can plug that into something like CBT, which is going to run that at scale across multiple different devices. It's going to enable us to say, okay, on Netscape 3 or whatever it might be, is our website still rendering correctly? So the idea, again, that we can take the work that we've done in one place and kind of migrate it through is really powerful. And I think that really hits home when we start talking about the API lifecycle story down at the bottom. Obviously, today we'll be pushed all the way to the left bottom corner there with SwaggerHub and the specification. But that specification, again, can act as kind of the definition that drives a lot of what we do after that. So when we get into development, we can virtualize very quickly using the specification. We can test anything that we build using the specification as both an assertion point and a generator for our test suite. And then we can also use it as part of a performance test scenario. So there's a lot of flexibility here when we start looking kind of at this whole map of what we do here at SmartBear. Cool, so let's go ahead and dive in. Again, we'll go through some slides here, hoping to take maybe 15 minutes to go through these and then and dive right into the demo. As I mentioned before, the thing I want to really start with is why are standards kind of important? Why is it something that we want to talk about, or why is it something that we're building into our product and really making kind of a key piece of what we do at SwaggerHub? These numbers, again, came from the survey that we recently ran, but one of the more interesting things in my mind was the role of quality when it comes to the way that we view and the way that we understand how an API works or how we relate to an API. There were a couple that were, big kind of needs as a consumer, as an API consumer. Of course, high performance was first and foremost, right? It was top of the list, but right underneath it was usability and API quality. And so when we start to think about how our APIs are perceived by that consumer, yes, it has to be high functioning and it has to, actually return data in kind of a reasonable amount of time, but it also has to be not only easy to understand, but has to kind of make sense, right? That the quality of the design has to be understood. And I think this gets amplified when we start talking about exposing multiple different services. If we're an API-focused business and we have multiple different services, and I'm saying business, this could be external, it could be kind of an internal group of APIs that we expose. The idea of all of these following kind of a loose or kind of a set of standards really, again, drives home this idea of quality in API design. API developers recognize quality as a top priority. Again, just as I mentioned before, over 3/4 mentioned that it was very important, and then another, just under half said it was extremely important. So obviously a little divided the numbers here, but I thought this was really interesting. Again, that the quality being such a big driver of how we interpret APIs. And then finally, poor API quality has real consequences. This is from kind of the provider side, but 45%, almost half of providers correlated poor quality to potential loss of customers. The idea that when we kind of do a disservice to our users, when we don't expose things correctly, when we're kind of making it hard to work with these services and these APIs, it's very easy for them to say, well, the guys right over there make this really easy. I'm just going to, it might be a little more expensive, but I'm just going to switch over and start using their services. So it's really important that we, again, ensure not only the initial quality, but ongoing quality from version 1 through 2, 4, whatever it might be. The last one there I think is kind of interesting, and it's something we mention every now and again, the idea of a developer experience, right? Very common that we talk about user experience or kind of the front end of a service or a website or something like that. We interpret that as the way that we engage with customers. But when we look at something like APIs, we engage directly with developers and our consumers, our users, through these services. So we don't have a lot of the kind of icing that we can put on the cake and say, okay, forget about all the stuff that might not work great. It looks really good. So that's going to kind of influence the experience. We're going to be much more kind of on the spot as to what we're providing and as how that's going to be interpreted. So I did think it was really interesting that, again, almost half of the responders worried that exposing poor quality APIs would damage the company brand and reputation. I think that really kind of drives home the value of, or the importance of, the developer and the developer mindset when we're, kind of building new products and the way that the industry is shifting a little bit. So just building off the idea that quality is super important, standards are a way for us to enforce that quality, right? when we start to enact standards, and this isn't, every little piece of this has to be kind of laid out and follow a certain rule set. I think it's much more effective when we have these high-level standards. We have a very good idea, across our entire organization. What do we really want everything to look like? What do we want the feeling of working with one of these APIs to be like? Do we want to have just a single, path that people can get everything from? Do we really want to streamline the experience, or do we want to expose as much as possible? Do we want to have this really deep and rich developer experience that we just give all this different flexibility, and each of those comes with their own kind of benefits and kind of issues, right? It's something that might be really deep, might be really confusing, or kind of put off the initial kind of early stage user, while it might be really useful for someone who's much later in the process. So standards enforce quality. They're directly related. When we asked the survey, or when we ran the survey, standardization was the #1 challenge that teams were looking to overcome in the new year. So I thought this was really interesting. Everyone knows that it's an issue. Everyone's kind of exploring and looking at ways that we can kind of reason and enforce these things. But it's an ongoing thing, right? I think it's a pretty common number, a pretty similar number to what we got in the responses when we ran this a little while back. So standardization is just one of those things that keeps kind of ongoing and ongoing. Versioning, that was another one that was a challenge. When do we version? What do we version? What is something that is a breaking change or non-breaking change? The idea here being that when we tie things back to something like a definition, we can have those types of conversations against that specification, against that definition of an API, as opposed to us building something, putting it into like a staging or development space and saying, all right, guys, is this going to work? Is this going to break things? Or do we really need to kind of rethink and make some tweaks here? So when we can have those kinds of conversations, when we can define the quality, when we can catch quality issues earlier in new versions and on kind of iterations of an API, not only can we kind of iterate quicker so we can make those changes and get feedback in an even shorter loop, we're going to save a ton of money. It's when we can do that in a short amount of time versus development resources doing that is a really important piece and has a very significant kind of impact on cost of development. Over 50% of organizations using internal style guidelines. This is something that we hear a lot about. We have these like rules that everyone at our organization follows, right? It's a Word document that's been posted on the wiki for the last 6 years, or it's a PDF that's been shared since 1993 or something like that. This is a very common practice, right? We have these set of rules that we want to enforce, but the goal is, how do we do that in an efficient way? We're speeding up development. We're speeding up this development process. The last thing that we want to do is introduce a bottleneck where we say, okay, this is great, but we still have to hand it off to a review group who's going to go through this line by line and say, okay, every little piece of this that we kind of build out, does it follow this internal guide? And, depending on the scale of what we're trying to do, that could be a really impactful kind of change, or a really impactful kind of piece of the process that we might be trying to build out. Finally, style guidelines are important or higher for over 50% of respondents. Again, just driving home the idea that quality is super important. Style and standards are directly tied to quality. And I think there's a good understanding of that across the industry. Great. So this is where we're kind of transitioning this mentality, quality standards. How do we relate that back to OpenAPI? How do we relate that to Swagger and the tooling that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes? The idea here is that we want to design effective standards. We want to, at that design level, be able to say, okay, this is what we want for all of our APIs. We want to be able to say, across our organization, here's a very streamlined collection of different definitions, or here's our documentation. And we can see, when we sit back and look at them all together, they follow the same kind of standard rule set, or they have the same kind of feel or touch that we want to expose to our consumers. Intelligent design ensures quality moving forward. Again, when we do this at an earlier stage, it impacts the rest of the process all the way down to the operations, monitoring, kind of deployment piece. When we can catch quality issues as early as possible, we're going to, again, as I mentioned before, save everyone a headache and save the organization a good amount of money by resolving those as far left as possible. So how do we really enable it? Again, as I mentioned before, I think defining a workflow that makes sense is important. This isn't automate everything. This isn't, we want to have this, magic linter, or, this magic box that we feed all of our designs into and it spits back. whether or not it passes this internal style guideline. I see a lot of teams migrating to this automate everything kind of approach, and I see a lot more kind of effective teams doing that selectively, where they realize where they can automate their process, and they kind of hone in on that and really do a good job of building that automation piece out. And then it kind of couples with something like a manual review process. So we can have confidence when we submit something to a review board, it's already gone through like that linter, it's already gone through that validation piece. They're really just looking at like, how does it feel as a consumer to interact with this API? And I think that when we kind of transition our mindset and our review process into that, we can start to make more impactful changes, and we can develop better software here. The third one in the list here, design and catalog pre-approved assets. This is something that we'll touch on during the demo. The idea that we have this like collection of things that we know that we're going to reuse, and we want to standardize those across an organization. If I'm, Amazon, I probably have a pretty good idea of what a book object looks like. But depending on how they build software, or how to develop software, it might be that each team could potentially interpret that or build their own, quote unquote book object. Doesn't make sense. We want to be able to say, okay, across every single product page, every single API interaction, every single delivery or whatever is going on, that book should look and feel the same, so that whenever we try to integrate or we try and consume that data from whatever API, I have a really good understanding of what that information, what that object is going to be kind of providing to me. Sorry. Finally, the stage, virtualize, and test piece. Again, staging, virtualizing, this is something we can do very, very quickly at a very early stage in our process, and I think really pays dividends right up front, right? It's great that we can kind of hand off something like documentation, and we can say, okay, here's what it's going to do. When we can actually hand off like a quote-unquote service that we can build a few interactions with, we can consume if we wanted to, we can actually get a much better feeling. It's not like, okay, I'm thinking about how this is going to feel to work with 6 months from now. It's right now, how does my kind of application, how does my client side interact with the thing that you've just built? And I can give more relatable feedback. I can see those changes made very quickly. The idea of virtualizing and kind of iterating on that virtual asset before we actually hand this off into the development space, I think is pretty important. And finally, testing. Obviously, the more we can test, the kind of further left and right that we can test from early stage to late, we can really start to build, again, more efficient and more effective APIs. So I will mention there's some existing solutions out there, and I'm sure a lot of people are using these currently or have explored these. Linters, very common. I was actually just reading about new API boilerplate, and one of their big things was that they had this built-in linter to make sure that everything that was changed in there followed these rules. And I think this is pretty good, but it's really focused on the code level, right? The idea that we have this like process or kind of box that's scanning through the code that we're developing is very granular. And when we try and map that back to like a design or to kind of an API development, like early stage development process, I don't think that it translates very well. We would have to try and take those granular rules and apply them to something that's a little more high level. So while linters will be effective in catching things like formatting errors in a specification, I don't think that they're the perfect solution for standards when it comes to building APIs. Custom in-house style validators, this is something that we see a lot of teams using currently, as I mentioned before, and a lot of teams starting to migrate away from. I think the cost of operating one of these and maintaining it is really the big impactor here. If we're essentially building our own product in-house to validate the code that we're writing, there's usually a better way to do that. The last thing that we want is to take development resources or, to have, a developer leave who is in charge of this validation piece, and then we have to bring someone on and train them up. And in that time, nothing happens and there's issues. I do think it makes sense to kind of, again, selectively work with partners and kind of other processes when it makes sense to. As I mentioned before, we want to automate as much as possible, but really only where it makes sense. Peer manual review, effective but time consuming. Again, we talk about this a lot from the code level with something like Collaborator, and I think that there is still a place for peer and manual review in the kind of API design process, but it shouldn't be, again, as granular as something like, spelling or making sure that every sentence has a capital and a period at the start and the finish. That feels like a waste of time when we can actually just kind of do that through something like a high-level process. And so really that's kind of what we're trying to solve today, is how do we kind of elevate these kind of solutions to that next level, and how do we apply them effectively to something like an API designer specification. Step in SwaggerHub, which is what we'll be working in today. SwaggerHub is interesting. It's a collection of the open source tools that we provide in Swagger and the Swagger kind of tool set. So the editor, the UI components, the CodeGen piece, it's bringing those all into a platform solution. And the idea here is that we're really trying to enable teams to use OpenAPI to use the Swagger tools at scale. When everyone's running their own version of the Swagger editor on the distributed machines, it's great. Everyone's using and generating OpenAPI, but there's plenty of room for issues and for misalignment there. When we start to do this on a platform, we can start to organize our teams. We can start to organize our developers into teams. We can start to enable things like API standards. We can start to use reusable assets, what we call domains. And again, we can start to do that at an organization level. So instead of it being kind of a team-based or very granular thing, we can kind of elevate this and, again, kind of do it from a top-down approach as opposed to the bottom-up. A single source of truth for distributed services. This is really where we start to get into that automated piece that I mentioned. So, there's still going to be that manual process of building or kind of designing an API. Some will generate a definition through code. We won't get into that today. We still are going to have something like a CI or a CD process that's wanting to consume that. So we do expose an API with the tool. It makes it very easy for any service, distributed or otherwise, to kind of look back to SwaggerHub, to that central repository, grab the definition, use it for testing, for virtualization, for deployment. If we want to say, okay, gateway, X, this is what the API does. This is the routes and the different methods. This is what we're going to have to support. Really makes it easy for us to kind of, again, automate where it's most useful. Developers, architects, everyone working in the same space. This is a big piece of what we do, the idea of having a collaborative environment to work in. So if I'm an architect, I'm designing a new API, I want to get feedback from the developers who will be consuming it or building it, or maybe I'm building it, designing it for a third party or something like that. We can actually, within the tool, start to bring people in, get their feedback, get their input, and then start to build that in again at that design stage, so that when we get to the actual development piece, we have a much more, reasonable or much more kind of well thought out design, that we're not going to hand off to something like a partner or a third party and they're going to come back and say, this doesn't meet any of our requirements. We should have talked about this months ago. We can do that at a much earlier stage. Cool. So we will go ahead and jump right into a demo now. Pretty pleased with myself on timing there. Ryan, any questions or anything that we want to field? I see the little light blinking, but anything we want to cover before we get too far into this here?
We talked about some of the different methods teams are using. And so I was wanted to just quickly, we just launched a quick poll in the webinar. I thought it might be interesting to get a sense from the audience, whether or not these different methods are something that they're using today. And so we're seeing, if anyone wants to kind of share what they're doing to kind of enforce this process. Yeah, so it looks like we're seeing, a bit of a mix here, but for the most part, it seems most people are still following a bit of a manual review process. And then a good amount of people who, as of today, really don't really have anything in place. And that seems to be kind of the two main winners that we have here in terms of, what teams are currently doing today. And, as Nathan talked about, we're going to be going into more of a demo to kind of show, how SwaggerHub could potentially fit in, or how a workflow with SwaggerHub could fit in. But, just share the results to give a sense for people if they think that they'd find it interesting to kind of compare what they're doing today to what others are doing. As we're showing these results, I want to say, we will save more time towards the end of this session. One of the things that someone mentioned was, and maybe you'll speak to a little bit, but maybe we can just quickly touch on it, is, someone talked quickly about, an API management platform, something like a MuleSoft or something like that.
Yep.
Is that something, is that a tool people would use for, how does a platform like that maybe work when it comes to, enforcing standards, and maybe you could just quickly talk to how a platform like SwaggerHub maybe kind of fits into that workflow?
Yeah. So we get asked about MuleSoft quite a lot, the Anypoint platform or solution. I think the thing that separates us from them really is that they try and solve issues from start to finish, right? It's the entire API development lifecycle, from the initial design through deployment and kind of hosting. It's this entire lifecycle. They have this kind of process that they want you to follow. with SwaggerHub, with the Swagger tooling, we're really focused on the design piece. We want to really solve the problems that teams are having at that design level. So we actually see a lot of groups augment something like a MuleSoft or a platform deployment with the SwaggerHub component. So, we can integrate really nicely, again, through the APIs and through the connections that we can make there. We can say, okay, this, after we've gone through design, it's going to get handed off to development and operations, that kind of thing. That's still going to happen through this like pipeline process that MuleSoft handles, but the kind of collaborative or kind of the feedback piece, that central repository for these definitions, we do actually see a lot of groups really engage and start to, again, augment something like a platform solution with SwaggerHub. And really, we're designing this, or this is built as again, solving an issue or a set of issues at one piece of the development lifecycle. It's not from start to finish, here's everything in a magic box that we're going to be able to do. It's we're really successful at kind of doing this thing around API design and collaboration. So I think it's a great question, and again, it's something that we end up talking about quite a lot. And I think that we have a pretty good or nice kind of relationship with those types of tools.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think now we can kind of hop into the demo portion here, and then that way that we'll end up saving ourselves enough time towards the end of the session for some additional Q&A. But as people have questions, definitely keep putting them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them towards the end.
Cool. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive into a demo. Again, this is kind of a distillation, let's call it, of a number of different processes that I've been a part of, kind of overseeing, not overseeing necessarily, but kind of looking at or kind of helping out with and kind of seeing in use at some different organizations. So the first thing that we'll talk through is the demo process that we'll go through, and then we'll map that to SwaggerHub, and then we'll jump into the tool and actually take a look at it here. So this is probably pretty common to what some groups might see. And again, we're not trying to rewrite the Bible or whatever it might be here. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to augment an existing process and just make it more effective. So when we talk about Swagger and the SwaggerHub workflow, let's imagine that we have an initial version of an API, something that was developed 6 or 8 months ago, has been working successfully. We've got some new requirements coming down, so we need to make a new version. The first piece of this is going to be deciding, is it a major or a minor version, right? Is it going to be a breaking change, something that we're going to have to alert users to, maintain 2 versions of the API for a little while before we deprecate one? Or is it something that's augmenting existing functionalities? It's just layering on. It's not going to change anything drastically. We're just exposing new functionality. And again, that's kind of the initial check that we have to go through. We would implement our changes, right? We would kind of have a rule set, and we'll talk about this in just a second. We'll have this like overarching rule set that we need to follow when we're making those changes. So we have an idea of what a new method might look like. We're going ahead, filling that out in our design. Before we hand that off to review, we actually have these standards that are being validated, and we can do that right within the tool. That review piece, that's still going to be manual. I think that this is still an effective piece of the process, and I think it's still an important piece of the process, where we have someone who sits down, has a good understanding of Team A, Team B, Team C, all of the kind of work that they're doing in parallel, without kind of necessarily communicating directly with one another. But the reviewer will get the version 1.1, whatever it might be, and be able to say, okay, this is good, but Team 2 was successful in kind of doing it a slightly different way. And so, why not try to use some of that information? So I do think that manual review is an important piece, and we'll talk about how we can start to enable that within our tooling in just a second. Finally, changes made, return for random review. The idea here being that, we catch something, we send it back to the development team, they have to update their API design, submit it back for a review, everything looks good, we finally kind of publish it for consumption so that it can actually be handed off to our development group, and the API can actually start to have work done against it. How does that translate to SwaggerHub? Pretty straightforward. We have in the tool a couple of different layers. So we have this organization, or what we call an organization, which would essentially be like an overarching group and multiple teams, projects, verticals, whatever we want to call them. Within there, we would have kind of subsections of those. So these could be like different development groups, review groups, testing groups that all have their own buckets that they work within, and we can actually kind of migrate a definition from one stage to the next. I've also seen projects break down in slightly different ways, but I think for what we're talking about today, having like an organization for our team and then having different kind of stages within that is going to be the most effective way to start to use the tool for enabling API standards here. So let's go ahead and dive right into the platform, and we can take a look at what this looks like within SwaggerHub. Just make sure I've got the right page open here. So I'll just jump back to the initial kind of landing page. On the left-hand side, we have a collection of, in this case, all the organizations that I'm a part of. So at the starting point here, we're imagining that I'm a developer. We have maybe one API that we maintain here, the store API. And when we look at this, we've just gone through our busy time of year. If we're a store, we've just kind of gotten through the holiday period. And we've got some new requirements that have come down from our end users, from our kind of management groups. We need to go ahead and make some changes here. So again, the first thing that we want to do is understand what kind of change are we going to implement, and is that going to be a breaking one? Let's imagine that right now we have an inventory API, so we're able to get inventory information, but we only have two methods: post, submitting data, and get, to retrieve it. We got some feedback that we actually want to augment data very frequently, so we need to go ahead and create a patch method here. And again, that's something that we're layering on. It's not necessarily going to change any of these existing ones. So for that, let's go ahead and create a new version. And SwaggerHub does a nice job of cataloging these. It stores the API definition under a high-level name, in this case, store API. And then within that, we actually have a kind of version tick. So we can see here that when we actually look at the path, and if we were to query the API directly, we have the name of the service, we have the version, and then we can start to kind of think about how this would build one after the other. So let's go ahead, add a new version here. We'll call it 1.1.0. And let's just set this to private and go ahead and create that. Perfect. So we'll notice that a couple of things have changed. With 1.0, as it was published, it's essentially a read-only document. So the idea here being this is the thing that's live, exists somewhere in like our, production environment. It's being utilized. We never want to change this because this has very real consequences on our documentation, on the consumption side. So we always want to make sure that, as soon as something is published, that we're not kind of revoking that in any way. So now we've got this nice workspace that we can kind of play around in. We can treat this as development space as opposed to something that's live. So let's go ahead and close that back up. And again, we want to go ahead, and our requirements that we got down were that we need to add this new method. So I won't make everyone sit through me writing a new piece of the Swagger specification. We'll just go ahead, copy paste some data here. And I think I said patch, so let's go ahead and update that. Great. So there's a couple of things that we can see going on here. One, the tool itself is actually validating the specification. So down at the bottom, we can see that right now we're not adhering to the rules of the OpenAPI spec. And this is like the highest level of standards that we're trying to enforce, right? The specification has its own kind of opinions as to what can exist and cannot exist in an API. Something like a post body, what kind of data do we need to have in here to be able to pass or be valid OpenAPI. In this case, when we open this up, we can see that we have duplicate operation names. So immediately we've been told, this is something that we need to update. So let's go ahead and change that. Cool. All right, and once this resolves, we should see, that's my mistake. Just changed it in the wrong place there. Perfect. Great. So now we can see that that's passing. We've got a valid specification. And, from my perspective, we've implemented this change. Things are looking pretty good. We can go ahead and save this. Now, we haven't actually enabled any standards here. The idea being that we want to now hand this off again to that review board or to that review user who's going to go through this and kind of double check, these changes that were made, are they in line with what we kind of intend? Now, as part of this, we're going to be able to show off one of the new features within the tool, which is our API standards settings that we can start to kind of layer into this. So from my development perspective now, this is ready for review. So let's go ahead and hand this off to this review group. Again, these are different projects that we kind of talked through earlier. And I just have to remember here, store API. And when we go back now and look at that review space, we have the store API stored there. Now, one of the nice things is that within the organization, I can actually be a part of one project but not another. So if I'm a review user, I could be invited to this review space but have no exposure to what's going on in that development world. And as soon as I get a new API pushed into my environment, I'm going to get an email saying, kind of a new API has been delivered. We need to go ahead and essentially review this and sign off on it. So let's go ahead, log out, and just log back in as that quote-unquote review user. Here we go. And so in this kind of approach, the idea here is that we are actually the reviewer for multiple different organizations. So these could be a whole bunch of different teams, across kind of our org. We got the email about one here in SC Design. Let's go ahead and open up our review panel. Take a look here, and we want to make sure we're working on our 1.1 version. So let's say that we have some different kind of standards that we want to enforce. There's a couple of ways that we can approach this. Maybe from my review perspective, I'm starting to see there's all kinds of issues here. The summary is just kind of dropped in there. It doesn't actually read well for the consumer. I can see that this is actually an ongoing issue from previously. We've also got some assets down here that were defined locally. And I know that an inventory item, for example, is something that I want to have be standardized across my entire organization. So the first thing that I want to do is jump back, and at an organization level here, we're going to be able to open up our settings and introduce API standards or standardization rules. As soon as we tick this box, we're going to be able to select a couple of these. So let's say the summary should start with an uppercase and end with a period. Let's say that operations must have at least 200. That feels like a good one. And this is another one. APIs must not have local definitions. We can only have external references. So this is something that we can kind of enforce from this high level. And if we jump back to now this review panel, we can see that we've got this standardization failed notification. So I know right away, if this was kicked over to me for review, this is not adhering to the rules that I have enforced, I would be able to return this and say, hey, development team, you need to go ahead and make some changes here to get this to pass these different rules. When we open up the definition, we can see that we get a list of where we're kind of failing these things, and that's shown on the panel on the left-hand side. This is also a nice way for us to introduce our commenting feature. So for instance, we have this local definition. I can say, hey guys, time working on reusable assets. Let's use them, right? So now we've made our comment, we've given our feedback. This is not past the review process. Actually, we want to make sure we're doing that in the right version. We've not passed the review process, so now we want to be able to hand this back to the development team and have them go ahead and make those changes to essentially pass the new rules that we've enforced. Here we go. Great. So one more time, let's just switch users here. Open up that same API. And now we can see that we need to go ahead and start to make some changes. So the easiest ones here are capitalizing our summaries and adding a period here at the end. And that should be pretty quick to do here through these different ones. And we also need to know that we have to remove these local definitions. Now, this creates an issue because this data needs to exist somewhere. And from kind of a high level, I need to be able to create a reference. The tool supports this idea of domains. And the idea of a domain is that we take these local definitions and we store them in kind of a centralized place. If we go back and we look up our model domain, we can see that this is actually a collection of things like our errors, the inventory item that we had just defined locally, the manufacturer. This is all stuff that we want to be able to say, okay, across the entire organization, across all of our development teams, use these assets. And that also means that when we actually want to make a change, like let's say that we add a new kind of property to this inventory item object, there's only one place that we have to do it, and that will kind of trickle down to all of the development groups and all the teams that are referencing this. So it's a really powerful way to start to, again, enable standards at a high level and kind of a hands-off approach, right? We have, this collection of assets, we have these rules that we're enforcing. We still have that review process to make sure, things are kind of running smoothly. or that we're getting the touch and feel of the API correct. But some of the kind of more granular stuff we're actually handing off to the tool to handle. So let's go ahead and jump back into the definition and just take a look at what this looks like to pull in one of those domains. We have this really neat autocomplete feature where we can actually just remove one of these local definition references, hit Control Space, and it pulls up a list of all of the domain objects that I have stored in my organization. So I think this was the inventory item that I wanted to pass in here. We can see that this is an external reference again to the domain that we were just looking at. But this is going to resolve. So as soon as I open up my response on the right-hand side, we should be able to see, I had that correct, my get method, we should be able to see that that object is still there. So it's not like it's just some kind of ambiguous reference that we have to follow a link and go and look. From the consumption perspective, we're always going to see the resolved object. So it's a really nice way again for us to kind of streamline this process, and for the consumer, they would have no exposure to this kind of piece of the puzzle. So let's go ahead and just resolve these last few issues. Again, we want to update this to that inventory item. There we go. And these checks, the kind of standardization rule checks, happen every time I save. So they'll kind of persist while we go through and make these changes. But when we actually hit the save button, we should see that those resolve, and we should feel confident that we can hand this off again to that review team. Let's go ahead and save this now. Just get this down a little bit. There we go. Perfect. Look at that. So we're passing all of these standardization rules. Again, this is pretty loose compared to the bigger picture of what generally gets done. But now, we could migrate this back into that review board. They could go ahead, sign off on this. The idea here being that we would, as soon as this is, quote unquote live or ready to have work done, we would publish it and again lock this into a read-only state. Now, we do have this toggle to set as a default. I see a lot of groups and a lot of teams use this to define what is essentially like production. So this 1.0 would probably remain the default for the foreseeable future. We wouldn't unpublish this definition unless we had something really, really wrong that we needed to fix. But eventually we would go ahead and set 1.1. Once it was live in production, we would set it as the default. And then when we do something like take a look at the documentation, by default we would serve up the 1.1. So again, it's a really nice way for us to start to enforce standards in a few different ways. I know we kind of jumped around a little bit, but I think the tool does a really nice job of handling this through the new feature, the API standards that we can enforce. Again, this rule set that is going to live for the entire organization regardless of the API or the development process. These are rules that we want to enforce everywhere. And then we want to create these reusable assets, right? We want to have these things that we can create a reference to and are standardized and reviewed and go through their kind of own parallel process separate from what we do here in the API layer. The last thing that we'll do here is we'll just go ahead and resolve this comment so we can see that, hold on. I could reply, resolve, and this is still going to be cataloged. So if I ever said this and I hadn't actually resolved it, I'd know exactly kind of who replied. But in this case, things are looking pretty good. So we can, again, hand this off to the review board with the confidence that they would be able to then publish this and hand this off to development. Cool. So that about wraps it up for the SwaggerHub piece. Again, just to recap, we looked at the standardization features. We looked a little bit at the domains piece here. There's a lot more that we could potentially do with the tool when we start to get into that workflow piece. And there's a lot more that we're going to be doing down the line. We've got some really exciting work being done in the development side right now that we're really looking forward to kind of getting out into the public view. So there's a lot more kind of around this like workflow and standardization piece coming in the new year. And yeah, we'd be happy to kind of take the next, 10 minutes to answer some questions, see if there's anything that was kind of coming up as we went through there, Ryan.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. And folks who've been on the line, we've seen a ton of questions coming in. I've done my best to jump on those as they've come in, but we have a good amount of time here, at least another 10 minutes to answer some of those. I also want to let everyone know that, when we typically do these webinars, specifically when we're showing, a deep dive of the product, we typically start to get a lot of questions that are very focused on the typical use case within their organization. So what we like to do is we offer the option if you wanted to set up a personalized call or demo to learn more about how the SwaggerHub tool can fit into your existing workflow. I just shared an additional poll in here. If you answer to this as kind of a special thank you for joining us today, we could have someone reach out. We don't have to schedule that today, obviously, but to answer any questions that you have, or just to better understand kind of what your existing workflow looks like and how you might want to fit a tool like this into your workflow. So whether you're looking to understand how it syncs with your existing tools like GitHub or Bitbucket, or push the API gateways that you have, or just understand what rules you're trying to enforce and how we can help with that. We're happy to help kind of connect you with a member of the Swagger team here to help better understand how this tool can work for you. So we shared that in there, but why don't we jump right into some of the questions that have already come in.
I see a big common one right at the bottom of that list about OAS 3. So coming on to that one first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's jump right in.
Yeah, so someone called it that. We've been using Swagger, the 2.0 version of the spec, really just because I have the 2.0 version handy for the demo this morning. We do support 3.0 within the platform. We can actually convert this, so that's a really good kind of use case as well. Let's say that we've got this live. The review board comes back and says, hey guys, we've standardized now on 3.0. You need to kind of make these changes. We can just go ahead and convert this, and it will actually map this to the new version of the specification. There may be some small changes that we have to make here, but at a very high level, we can now support 3.0 within the tool. We have a number of different integrations that support 3.0 as well as 2.0. And when it comes to the CodeGen piece of this is something that we're very actively working on as well. So a lot of these CodeGen libraries, client and server stubs, we had in 2.0, and now we start to roll these out in 3.0. And this is something that's ongoing. So I think every couple of sprints, we're kind of adding new libraries and new stubs here in the right-hand menu.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know we get a lot of questions on that. SwaggerHub is one of the first tools that really, we released initial support for just doing the basic design of actually writing spec for OAS 3.0, and we continue to add new functionality. And we're excited to see that even some of the other gateways that are out there, I think AWS just added 3.0 support. So more and more, we're seeing people move that direction, and you'll continue to see some new support rolling out there. So definitely excited to see that. I think we can probably go through some of these, but one of the questions I got earlier that someone asked about was, how are the changes that are made really communicated to the developers who are kind of writing the code? So, someone asks, I know we showed the commenting feature, but someone asked, typically, these are submitted to, GitHub to understand what changes are being made, things like that. This may be a functionality question. It may just be kind of a recommendation question, but how do we typically see that these changes that are made on the design are communicated to the people who are actually developing the API?
Yeah, so I've seen a couple of different approaches. One is going to be using something like a kind of a version control system. So hooking this up to something like GitHub, where we would make changes to this design, right? We have these like server stubs, so we have these like templated versions that we can start to kind of push out of the tool, and these we can actually kind of customize as well. So not with the SaaS version of the tool that we've been working with, but we do on-premise deployments, and you can actually load in customized code templates. We can push those out to different GitHub repositories and branches as part of this process. So when I save, when I publish, we're actually writing that to that developer kind of workspace. And as many of you, I'm sure, will know, as soon as we get into GitHub, that's really the bread and butter, right? Is being able to see, okay, between a couple of different files, or maybe the specification that's in there, or maybe the model definition list that gets generated. What are the differences between kind of commit 1, commit 2 that just came in, or branch 1 and branch 2? And we can start to use that kind of side of the coin to start to understand where we need to write new code. The other piece is going to be kind of a little more manual. So we bring them in, we say, okay, these are the changes that we need to implement and augment, and we do that through the commenting system that we have. The final thing that I've seen teams do is using like something, especially when we start to scale this up to like thousands and thousands of lines for one of these APIs definitions, something like a diff viewer. So there's open source tools out there that will allow us to load in 2 different files, look at them side by side, and say, okay, this is the differences between A and B, and this is where we will need to make some changes. And again, this is similar to what we talked about with the GitHub piece, but a lot less overhead, right? It's just like a straightforward, okay, load in one file, load in the second file. What's the difference? Where do we need to make these changes? This is something that I think that we could start to think about baking into the tool. We get a lot of questions about recognizing breaking changes in SwaggerHub, like when we implement new functionality, could the tool tell us when it's going to break something in a previous version? I think it's a really cool idea. We don't necessarily do it right now. We still kind of lean on some of these other tools, but it's definitely something that we're thinking about an awful lot here at SwaggerHub and at SmartBear.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. I know one of the questions that came in, and I can quickly clarify this, and if you want to look through some of the questions, if you have any thoughts on ones that you think we want to jump on as well. Someone asked about we're working in the kind of SaaS or browser-based version of SwaggerHub here. And someone else, we do offer the ability to kind of install on-premise as well, because I know some people, I think at least 2 people asked about kind of, would that be capable? So yes, we do offer that, an on-prem install. We can help you set up behind your firewall, because we do know that's a requirement for some people. But then again, if you're someone who can work right in the SaaS version, this is available for quick setup as well. Let's see. We had a couple different, I think I shared a link out into the chat, but to show kind of how you would compare the different changes that are made. And I know we have kind of the compare and merge kind of functionality within the tool.
We do have that, yeah.
That might be something that might be interesting to kind of quickly pull up. I know,
yeah. Let's see here. For KPI, compare and merge. So maybe if we jump back here, this will be easier with 2 specifications of the same version. Let's say that we want to compare this one with the previous 1.1 version. We could go ahead, compare and merge. We can grab any existing API. Let's just remember here. There we go. We can grab the name of it just from the list of the organization. So once this loads in, we'll have to just grab store API here. And then we can grab a version. And this is going to be like a very light version of what I was talking about with something like GitHub, where we'll get kind of a side-by-side view, and it will highlight, what has been changed, what has not been changed. Just taking a little time to respond here. But it's a nice way to do it directly within the tool. So instead of us, again, setting up this process or bringing this externally, we can start to do it right within the platform here. As soon as this loads. There we go. All right. I have to talk. Yeah, there we go. The server's not responding correctly. That might be on my end. We're in the, we're sharing streaming and all this other stuff. It might be on the other side, but we can definitely kind of talk through that in more detail if I get this to work. Let's see. Just do this directly. There we go. Okay, that's the way I should have done it in the first place. Here we have left and right, 2 different versions of the API. Once we get down to these changes, we can see exactly what was added, what was removed in version 1.0. These probably should be flipped left and right. I should have loaded up 1.1 and compared it to 1.0. But yeah, now we can see exactly what the 2 kind of files look like side by side, what the differences are. We could potentially merge data within here, whether it's the metadata and the design, or whether it's just the design. The idea being here, if we wanted to consolidate like multiple definitions into a single flat file, or if we wanted to, if we're going through some kind of consolidation process, and we're going to start to bring things together and see what's going to create conflict and what's not, or what's repetitious and what isn't, we can start to use that kind of functionality to kind of guide that a little bit. So that's a good question. I appreciate someone mentioning there, bringing it up, Ryan.
Awesome. I think we have time for at least one more question here. And I know, try to get to as many of these as we can. We've gotten some questions around the 3.0 support for CodeGen. Yeah, so we don't have full support for all the same ones for 3.0 as we have for 2.0. We are slowly rolling those out with each of the releases. So you can look for the CodeGen. If you don't see it listed in the tool today, that means that we don't have full support for that yet. But you can always kind of reach out to us via the kind of chat window we have in there, or shoot an email to the team at info@swaggerhub.com, and we can let you know when that'll be available if you're looking for a specific language.
Can I ask, can I answer one of the questions?
Sure, yeah. Let's answer one more, and we're probably going to wrap up here.
This is a good one. Where do we define the part where the inventory data is stored and modified? So this is kind of the domains piece that I mentioned before. right now this is a file that lives within SwaggerHub, right? So if we hover over this and we jump to this, we'll find that it's a similar looking but slightly different type of file. That's essentially a collection of reusable assets. It's a library, it's a collection, whatever we want to call it. Now, one of the interesting things that I just learned recently in playing around with SwaggerHub is that we don't actually tell you it has to come from a domain. So I've seen some groups, and I've explored this, store these domain definitions in another location. That could be like a Git repo that we can load these in through an API call. So this reference resolves. There's a few kind of, let's call them intricacies to this. So I wouldn't recommend going that external storage route, but it's going to load this in and render it on the right-hand side here just through an API call. So it is best to store them in SwaggerHub and using the domains feature, but we could potentially do it somewhere else as well.
Thanks again for a great presentation. Hopefully everyone walks away with something that they can put into practice and improve within their organization. So thanks a lot, and best of luck.
Thanks, everybody.